We actually have a little bit of extra time, mainly because the fish were flying a little faster than we expected them to be, or it to be. What we're going to do is we've got a period that we could devote to question and answer. My understanding is that there will be a couple of people with mics over there and Jason over there. So if you'd like to ask a question, if you could make your way to one side or the other, and I can't see too well from here, and while you're doing that, I'll start with a question for both of you, if you don't mind. If you're dealing with the geomorphology of a river system, your decisions are easy. You can understand what the river wants to do. You can understand where you can make room for it. But overlaying on that system is private property, are people's desires, needs, wants, people that are more or less cooperative with what you're trying to accomplish. So with your work, with your plans, are there cases where you've needed to buy out private property owners or knock heads, essentially, with private property interests, and how have you approached that?
Am I mic'd up?
Either one of you.
Oh. I guess I can start. We try not to knock heads with folks. I think at some level, like I think I showed the slide of the Rainbow Bend site. Almost all those homes, had a lot of moldy carpets. They had experienced flooding quite a bit. We bought out a large number of homes. I think it's in my PowerPoint. But on the order of about 360 acres have been protected through our home buyout program. That is really an important part of our, sometimes we just buy it out to keep it as open space. Sometimes it's purchased as a part of a project. The knocking of heads comes into place when somebody says, and this is, I'll never forget the moment when we had to do some condemnations. We can't do here in Washington State, we don't go through with condemnations for habitat reasons, but we do go through condemnations for infrastructure and flood protection. Our county council really doesn't like it. You really don't like putting elected officials in that space. So what we've done is, in a few instances, had to condemn them and go through that condemnation process. The elderly will get up there and say, I plan to die here. Why are you making me move? And you really have to build the case and show that, well, put it in the record and actually communicate the amount of public benefit to that. And I would say virtually everybody understands and appreciates and gets that when they do, when they see that. Nevertheless, I think in our most recent condemnation of some homes down in Pacific along the White River, we have been asked to go through a mediation process. So we'll do that, and it becomes a question of how much can our design accommodate them, and that's, I think our engineers have done a good job with that. So I hope that answers. Did you want to answer?
Yeah, I would just chime in that, I mean, you point to a critical issue, but I think the knocking of heads or the conflict that can occur with some of this floodplain management work that we all do is more likely to arise, based on my experience, when we pursue our goals independent of one another. That's what sets us up for conflict. And if we can approach things in a more integrated fashion, truly collaborative fashion, we're much more likely to avoid some of that. The 15 projects that I referred to, almost all of them have a land acquisition component. If you're making rooms for floods and fish and people, you need land. So there needs to be an acquisition component. It's usually, it's voluntary acquisition, all the projects that we've been involved with. But if you don't have the collaborative process up front, if we as a community don't invest in that, and it's messier and costlier on the front end, but it avoids the conflict, it avoids the mitigation costs, it avoids the lawsuits that we've been saddled with in the past. Right. So the goal is to avoid that by bringing sort of the social collaborative aspects in as much as we do the engineering and science.
Thank you. Any questioners out there? Well,
this one right here.
Go. I guess you can do it from here, Chad, but we're going to have to repeat the question. Yeah. Unless you want to come up.
Just repeat the question.
Chad Berginnis, Executive Director. Question I have is that in both presentations, setback levies were a critical component of your overall management of the floodplain. And I just would like to, this being probably nationally known as a very progressive area in flood management, just like to get your perspective on the value of setback levies as one of the tools in the toolbox to accomplish your overall river management objectives. Thank you.
I'll repeat the question. It had to do with a lot of the approaches having to do with setback levies and what you see as the value of the setback levies in your overall planning.
Well, it is one tool. If you're going to help Mother Nature along, and if that's the idea on floodplains by design, as Nature Conservancy's talked about, or accommodating really a longer term vision as to lower the risk for residents, businesses, lower your maintenance costs, having a river in a ditch is just going to be a long term cost there. So a setback levy can work, and it can be quite effective. It does come with its challenges that I tried to speak about. I would not say, though, that it is the only answer. There are some locations, and I showed a picture in the lower Green River Valley, where a setback levy may in fact not work, or in fact it might be a setback of 15 feet, so that you can accommodate a different geology or design on the levee system, or reduce scour, or do something for habitat in there. I can't speak to the decisions they made 100 years ago or 50 years ago when they put that river in the ditch, but nevertheless we have $8 billion worth of public and private assets in that Green River Valley. And the setback levy is not the only tool in that. In fact, some cases flood walls are appropriate, and in some cases there might be others. Now, we are going through a process that really takes a look at what level of safety do we want to plan for, and how do we get there? People may come to the conclusion, because of the urbanized uses behind it, that setback levies are just too expensive and we can't really accommodate anything greater than a 100-year storm event. In that case, it then is incumbent upon us all to communicate that risk to the businesses and the residents there, that when the big one comes, and they will come, of course, I'm told, and we've seen throughout the nation that I think you all know better than I, it will come. If you've only planned for a 100-year storm, that 500-year event's going to really do some serious damage. So it's one component, but not the only component.
Yeah, I totally agree. It is a tool, and I think the reason we might have highlighted those projects is it's the obvious example where you can achieve multiple benefits, because if you set a levee back, by design, you tend to be restoring riparian forests, wetlands that help filter water, improve water quality, recapture salmon habitat, create open space for public access, recreation. So in a single site with a single project design, you achieve multiple objectives. But there are other things. Some of the projects that we've helped secure funding for include addressing sediment issues. So we have hypersedimentation in some of our rivers, which raises the bed load, causes the waters to spill out more frequently. So we're installing large woody debris jams and such things, trying to stabilize upper portions of floodplain systems so that there's less erosion happening, sending sediment downstream. There's buyouts. There's a variety of things that are multiple objective in nature, because that sediment and such is bad for salmon redds, salmon nests, and the like as well. But the way I tend to think about what an integrated floodplain project is there's two different models. One is the sort of single action that achieves multiple objectives, such as with a setback levy. But some of this, particularly as we're trying to scale our work up to really think at a reach or watershed level, is there's just trade-offs you need to make. Setback levies aren't possible everywhere. We have urbanized environments. They're not cost-effective there. So there may be places where we need to do more traditional gray infrastructure, and then places where we can do more natural work to improve flood storage and the like. And by packaging those things together, you achieve the multiple objectives, but you're achieving it through a suite of actions across a reach, where each project might be more singularly focused.
I would want to just add to that on the lower green, our planning process is such that we're not going to be 200-foot setbacks. That's just not happening there. Or 100-foot setbacks is probably limited space so we could do that. But are there levee designs and systems that we could put in place that help on the habitat side? We still have an endangered species occupying that river system. And as King County government, we've invested a tremendous amount of money in making the middle green, which is the upper portion of that river system, a really nice place for for fish and for our endangered species, a recreational component as well for people to be. But if the fish are going through this gauntlet of hot water and an area that's just not going to work, they're going to be dead by the time they get to the middle green, and we have to actually have a better system for doing that. So it won't be a setback levy, but we can put in some new designs that accommodate some of the habitat values. And I applaud the Corps of Engineers for taking a step away from the traditional PL 8499 levee vegetation standards and allowing for a far more flexible understanding that we're dealing with this dynamic in those areas.
I think we have time for one or two more, and I think there's right over Dave. Oh.
Yes.
Oh, over there.
Bob Freitag, and this is for
Whoops,
Bob.
we got two. Let's go with Bob first, and then we'll go to Dave, and I think we'll shut it down after that.
Bob Freitag, and this is for Bob. On March 22nd, we had a landslide, and approximately $80 million is being spent to recover bodies. My question is that events really change our thinking, and events can be incorporated as opportunities as well as disasters. And my question is, in terms of your floodplain by design, has that changed your thinking, or can you, are you going to be able to use some of the discussion that's occurring in terms of what your objectives are?
Great question, Bob. And for those of you that aren't aware, maybe you've caught a snippet of this, but what Bob's referring to is the what's called the Oso landslide that happened in the upper Stillaguamish River Valley several weeks back. Very tragic event that pertains loosely to floodplain management. It's unique in that it was an entire hillside gave way. This is land way out of the floodplain, way above the floodplain, gave way and impacted a community that was largely located in the floodplain. I think the lesson there and the parallel to floodplains by design is that while that risk is different from a flood hazard or flood risk, the issues are similar, and what we're trying to do and what ultimately initiated our thinking about this work is an understanding that generally speaking, the areas that are most important to salmon recovery, which is really important to this region as sort of the iconic species of this area, those areas that are most important to salmon are the same areas where there's highest risk to people. So as we can do a better job of identifying where those extreme risks overlap with where the best habitat or water improvement projects are, there's some real win-wins there, and we can get smarter. We can leverage our political and financial resources to get more stuff done and keep more people out of harm's way, or help more people get out of harm's way at the end of the day.
I totally agree. I just want to add that the channel migration studies that the engineers and the professionals like you all do are very helpful in helping craft our capital programs and our home buyouts and such. But after that OSO event, it was what people call a watershed event or a Woodstock event, where it's a major shift in your thinking. Our folks got together and said, hey, what we really need to do is a little extra scope advance here and take a look at the intersection between the channel migration zone work that we do and the landslide potential. And we had to do that. It took a tragedy like that to just make that common sense linkage that I think that any geology folks would understand, and our own engineering geologists did. But really, one elected official came to me and says, so the maps in Snohomish County weren't that up to date. Ours are, right? 1990 maps, landslide. So no, we're updating them. Thank you for the question.
David Conrad, I think you kind of touched on this, but my question was just: is the floodplain planning? Do you find it as an entree to also talk about future conditions? The climate scientists are predicting some real issues with moisture for the Pacific Northwest, and it's the floodplains here, particularly in the Cascades, both sides, where those sorts of things could be real relevant. And I'm just wondering, so far, are these planning efforts an entree to talking about that, and how is the public reacting to that? Thanks.
Great question, David. Yes, absolutely. And I think perhaps not to the extent that we'd ultimately like to, but I showed the one example where we're working with a local community to develop a decision support tool. That is part of what's called the Sustainable Land Strategy, a collaborative agricultural, salmon, tribal, and county government process in Snohomish County. And in that work, while most of what we're doing is pulling together the information that they develop through their salmon recovery plan, their flood plan, et cetera, is the additional work we're doing, what they've asked us to do is to help them with that. And this is really interesting because it's largely the agricultural community that is interested. They are experiencing sea level rise, increased sediment, increased flows now. This isn't something in the future, it's happening now. And so we are doing some modeling specifically towards that end to be able to better understand and predict where the flood hazards, where the risks of the future will be in the whole lower reach of the Snohomish River.
It's a great question, and I don't want to look at some of my colleagues that I know are in the room because they will tell you the data doesn't exist yet for King County rivers to show that there's a relationship between climate change and flooding. Not yet, but the theory is that it's there. Most of our rivers are controlled by dams, and so you don't quite see that. Perhaps it changes the reliability or the risk around that dam and how it can function, but we don't have the data on our river systems yet. Moreover, I don't have the data to really go forward and ask for extra money, a bigger setback, a wider river channel based on a theory yet. So it gets to be a cost component to that. I think it's coming. There's no doubt about it, and I don't want to try to sound like I'm somebody in denial about climate change because it's there, and as Bob said, they're seeing it in other locations. But specifically to King County, it's our river. Most of our river systems aren't seeing it just yet. I think we will.
Oh, and I just add really quickly that it's not just climate that's driving hydraulic changes in the sediment regime. It's land use.
Oh yeah.
And folks are seeing that too. So we need, again, this is where the science comes into play. We need to look at those types of things. We need to not just look at what the historical record is, but what the future conditions are likely to be.